Welcome everyone, a very good afternoon, and we are starting our 11th webinar of the Evidence-Based Policy and Action Roundtable series. Today's webinar is titled, Will the Villages Prosper and Share? Understanding Inequality in the Rural Development Context. In the last webinar, we talked about the shared prosperity challenge in India from secondary data and literature. The Human Development Indicators reveal that India suffers from twin problems. One is of high levels of deprivation, and second is also from inequalities of access and achievement. So the method studies, as well as intense longitudinal village studies, they provide an opportunity to deeply understand the nature, driver, and nuances of the inequality of India's village. Also helps us to understand how inequality will interact with the village prosperity. So to reflect in India's shared prosperity challenge with evidence from longitudinal village studies, we are enthused to have Professor Peter Lanjouw, School of Business and Economics, Vrije Universiteit, Amsterdam, and Dr. Himanshu from Jawaharlal Nehru University, two of the leading global economists as our speaker today. The speakers, who are also the co-authors of the book How Lives Change, Palanpur, India and Development Economics, will engage in a discussion on the inequality question in India's village based on their study of the Palanpur village in Uttar Pradesh, India. Before introducing the speakers to you in detail, I would like to invite our Director General, Dr. G. Narendra Kumar, to deliver a welcome address and welcome our guests. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Rushira. I think it's a very interesting discussion today, a topical and very well-known, well-experienced speakers today. Professor Peter and Professor Himanshu, they have done extensive longitudinal studies in villages, especially the Palanpur study, something which heard of, saw briefly, but did not really go into the depth of it. So this is an occasion for us to catch up with that study, understand implications therefrom for policy studies, policy making that we are engaged in the National Institute of Rural Development and Panchayati Raj in trying to move towards developing a rural development policy, and what lessons we can draw from these studies. But before we go into further discussion, I thought I'll share some of my experiences with longitudinal studies. I work in the senior executive service of the Indian government. And by virtue of that, during our training, my first brush was with longitudinal studies about 32 years ago, when, as a probationer, as it is called in the Indian Administrative Service, I took up a study of a village called as Phalodi in Rajasthan, in the Savai Madhopur district of Rajasthan. So there, the basic issue was with a cement factory. A cement factory was set up in a completely rural village, and what transformation it brought about in the changes of life of people in that village, Phalodi. Over, as I recall now, I don't exactly recollect now, but I think over a period of about 2 decades or so, the cement factory ran well. But due to certain issues of mismanagement, it fell into bankruptcy. And when it fell into bankruptcy, the changes in life of the workers of that village who depended upon the cement factory. And that was a very stark contrast, how many of them could not get back to agriculture. At the same time, they didn't have credible sources of income, and creating income inequalities thereby. So it's a study of how income of some sections of society increased due to the coming of that cement factory, and how the income sources declined, and that led to an increase in the income inequalities in the follow the village. So that gave me very good insights on changes in the village economy and dynamics. Another brush that with the longitudinal studies that I had was part of the ICRISAT, International Crop Research Institute for Semi-Arid Tropics. They conduct a series of longitudinal village studies called the Village Dynamic Studies, VDS as it is called. A number of villages, starting with the Telangana state of Andhra Pradesh, and then moving on to other states, which significantly brought out the change in the nature of the village economy, the move from a farm-based, substantially farm-based livelihoods to a very substantial share in the village economy of non-farm livelihoods. So such like findings have come through, which influence policy very substantially and significantly. And from policy to program making and making the programs, existing programs more efficient. So I think the longitudinal studies have held their forte. And we would like to hear from the discussants today, their version of longitudinal study impact on inequality in the rural areas. So without much ado, I think I'll hand over the floor to the discussants to take us forward with their findings on longitudinal studies and inequality changes. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the introduction and addressing the participants. I would like to introduce the speakers to you, and then I will hand over the mic to our speakers today. Professor Peter Lanjouw is a PhD from London School of Economics and a professor in development economics. Prior to joining the VU Economics Department in January 2015, he had spent more than 2 decades in the Development Economics Research Group of the World Bank. Most recently, he has worked in the Poverty and Inequality team. He has taught courses at the Delhi School of Economics, the Foundation for the Advanced Study of International Development at Tokyo, and the University of Nehru, Belgium, and has held a visiting position at the University of California, Berkeley. He is current editor of the World Bank Research Observer and a past assistant editor of the World Bank Economic Review. He is a fellow of the Timbergen Institute and a core member of the Global Poverty Commission convened by the World Bank. Professor Lanjouw is widely published, mainly in the areas of measurement and analysis of poverty and inequality in developing countries, structural transformation in developing economies, and contribution of longitudinal village studies to the analysis of rural development. Welcome, Professor Lanjouw, and thank you for your time. I would also like to introduce Dr. Himanshu. Dr. Himanshu is an associate professor in economics at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and is a visiting fellow at the Center for Sciences and Women's, New Delhi. He has held visiting fellowships at the London School of Economics, British Academy Senior Visiting Fellow, and C.R. Parekh Fellow, UNU Wider in Finland, and Research Group on Quantitative Research in Economics at Marseille University in France. He has been involved with various government committees, including Expert Group on Measurement of Poverty, which you all know as Tendulkar Committee, National Statistical Commission, Reserve Bank of India, National Human Rights Commission, Ministry of Rural Development, and Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation. Other than his academic writings, Dr. Himanshu is a regular contributor to various media publications, including television. He writes fortnightly columns on issues related to development in Mint newspaper. He has received the Sanjay Thakur Young Economist Award of the ISLE and Personnalité d'Avenir of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Welcome, Dr. Himanshu, and thank you for taking up this time and talking to us about the Palanpur study and the inequality findings. So without much delay, I would like to hand over the mic to Professor Lanjouw, and after Professor Lanjouw, we'll move on to Dr. Himanshu. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ruchira. I'll try to upload a presentation here that I'll share with you. And can you see this?
Not yet, sir. Yeah,
So,
you can see it.
okay, so thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to spend some time with you today discussing the issue of inequality at the village level in rural India. This is a good opportunity for me to spend time discussing with you and also to share with you the insights that I have been able to obtain alongside my colleague, Dr. Himanshu, on the experience of economic development in the village of Palampur in Uttar Pradesh. My proposal is, hang on. I propose to start my intervention with a brief discussion about the issue of measuring inequality at the village level. Basically, the idea is that we actually are not very well placed to measure inequality at the village level if we take a sort of all India or a national level perspective. It would be nice to know what's going on at the level of each village in India, but that's not something that we can very easily observe. And I'll spend a few words discussing a little bit why that's so difficult, as well as mentioning a few possible entry points into resolving that particular difficulty. I'll then say a few words as to why we should be interested and why should we care about village level inequality, particularly from the point of view of policymakers. Why should policymakers be particularly concerned or interested in understanding and observing the level of inequality that arises at the level of the village in a particular country and across all villages? And I'll then present a little bit of evidence on why I think this is a matter of considerable importance for policymakers. We'll then discuss the specific case of India, first trying to get some feel, some broad parameters on how important village level inequality is in India as a whole. And then finally, I'll turn to the discussion of Palampur, the village with which I have been associated for quite some time alongside Professor Himanshu, as well as a large number of additional collaborators. And I'll spend a little bit of time discussing what we've been able to document in the case of Palampur over time. So turning to the question of why we know so little about local inequality that occurs at the very local level. In rural areas, we're talking about the village. In urban areas, we might be talking about a neighborhood. Why don't we know more about what's going on in terms of the distribution of income, say, at the very local level? Well, I'm sure I don't really need to emphasize this as it's well understood in India, but the standard data that we use to measure inequality in the developing country context, or in any country context, in effect, is to use household survey data. And these are usually nationally representative household survey. In India, they're very well-known national sample survey organizations, NSS surveys. There's also the India Human Development Survey that's available. These are large-scale household surveys that collect information on income and on consumption, and that allow us to estimate or measure inequality. And these surveys occasionally do allow for some subnational disaggregation. We can divide the country into urban and rural areas, or we can estimate inequality at the level of, say, a state or a province. But we are rarely able to estimate, using these survey data, estimate what's going on at the level of a village. We can't go to that degree of granularity, that degree of detail. There's such small locations, and estimate poverty outcomes or inequality outcomes at the village level. And that's because, of course, these surveys are just samples of the total population. And while the absolute sample size of, say, an NSS survey is quite large, it's still far too small to be able to actually have a representative sample at the level of every village in the country. Many, many villages in the country will not even be included in this NSS sample. And if they did happen to be included in the NSS sample, it's very unlikely there would be more than a handful of households included in that sample for that particular village. This would not be enough to allow us to actually estimate inequality at the level of the village. So in some respects, we can actually think, and this is a problem that's quite generic around the world, villages are in some sense statistically invisible when it comes to thinking about things like poverty outcomes or the degree of income inequality that might be arising at the village level. We simply don't have direct observations of inequality across all villages in India, say. Here's an example of what I have in mind. This is a case of what we could do with a household survey in the case of India. So with the standard nationally representative household surveys in a country like China here, we have the country divided up into a large number of provinces, and we can use the household survey to estimate, say, poverty or inequality at the level of each province. And the highlighted case here is the province of Yunnan. And so we can use our household survey in the standard way to estimate inequality at, say, Yunnan. But what we would really like to know is what's going on at the level of each township. This is an example of a map of poverty that we would like to be able to produce across the whole country, where we can actually estimate the poverty rate in every township of the state of the province of Yunnan. This is what we're actually after, but this is not something that's typically available. Why? Well, as I already mentioned, the household surveys aren't typically large enough in terms of their samples. So what could we do to resolve this particular dilemma? Well, the first thing we could consider doing is to just enlarge our sample size. Rather than having a sample size of, say, 100,000 households, we could increase it to 500 or maybe even 1 million households. Maybe that would give us enough data to be able to estimate inequality at the level of each village in the country. But of course, that's a terribly expensive proposition. And it may also be difficult to maintain quality standards if one were to dramatically, radically increase the sample size of the conventional household survey. The other option might be to say, well, let's look at some other data source. An example might be the population census. Let's work with the population census rather than the national sample survey data. The problem, of course, there is that the census does not collect the income or the consumption data that we would like to be able to look at in order to measure economic inequality. And so we might try to experiment with various kind of proxies, but it's unlikely that these would be very widely accepted, and they'd probably be difficult to interpret. In recent years, there's been some advances and there's been some progress made in terms of using alternative data sources, particularly remote sensing data, georeference data that allows one to sort of use satellite data to look at very granular outcomes, measuring things like temperatures or rainfall or so on. And there has been some progress in measuring, say, economic outcomes at the very granular level using these satellite data. It's a promising area of research, but it's not yet really reached the stage where we have good, reliable estimates of, say, village level inequality based on simply on such remote sensing data. So the final option that one could do is an option that is a direction that I've been involved in developing, and that's the employment of small area estimation methods to basically combine the household survey data that are available, in the case of India, NSS data, for example.
The voice is not clear.
As well as population census data. Is this better? Am I speaking is it too quiet, or should I be speaking more slowly? Or
it's clear, sir. It's quite clear.
Okay. So the alternative option would be to combine data using, say, census data as well as the household survey data that are available to produce estimates of inequality at the local level. And this is a direction in the statistics field called small area estimation that does seem to provide some possible directions for improvement. And in fact, that picture I showed you of the province of Yunnan in China, where the estimates of poverty were produced at the level of each township, had been basically produced using these small area estimation methods. So the idea here is to combine census and household survey data, and basically to estimate a model of, say, consumption in the household survey data, and then use common variables that are available as well as in the survey, as well as in the census, to impute this measure of consumption that is observed in the survey data, to impute it into the census. And once these census data have this imputed welfare indicator, this consumption measure or this income measure, we can then use the census data to calculate inequality at the level of every village or every urban neighborhood. So it's using these statistical prediction methods to impute into the census, thereby allowing us to work with the census as though it were a super large household survey with a measure of consumption or income as an indicator of interest. The appeal of this approach, of course, is that it does allow one to work with exactly the same concept of economic welfare that already exists in the household survey. So we're all comfortable with the measures of poverty that are reported in, say, from NSS data at the national level. Well, we can use exactly that same concept of poverty to now estimate poverty at the level of each village in India, or to calculate inequality at the level of each village using exactly the same concept. And that's a considerable appeal. The other feature that is important to emphasize is that while this is a statistical procedure, this imputation exercise, it does allow one as well to calculate the degree of confidence that one has around the estimates that result from that exercise. So the statistical precision can be gauged. The results are encouraging, but of course, it's really clear that that this procedure can only work when household survey and population census data are available at the unit record data and can be allowed to be merged in the way that I've just described. This process of producing these poverty maps or inequality maps has been sort of ongoing using this method for the past 2 decades or so. And I think there's something like 80 or so countries now in the world that have produced maps of poverty or maps of inequality using this method, including India. How successful is this approach? Well, the experience, it's obviously difficult to be able to prove that this works everywhere and all times, but when it has been possible to validate the methodology, it's been found to be really quite reliable. An example here in this figure is the case of Brazil, where we were able to compare these estimates of poverty against actual observed estimates of the poverty in a particular state of Brazil. And you can see that all these little dots, each of which represents a different municipality in Brazil. The larger ones are more populous and the small ones are less populous, but they're all different municipalities. And we're basically just correlating the estimated poverty in these municipalities against the actual poverty in those municipalities. And you can see that the estimates line up quite closely with the actual observed poverty rates at the municipality level. And this gives us some confidence that this estimation procedure works reasonably well. If we turn to the case of India, there has been some pilot efforts to apply these methods in the case of India. And this is based on a paper that was published in 2010 using the population census data in India from 2001 and the NSS data from 2004, 2005. And we have these 2 figures here, and this is an exercise that was carried out for 3 states, the states of West Bengal, Orissa, and Andhra Pradesh. And what we can see in this picture is that we can produce estimates of poverty at the tehsil level, and then we can also produce estimates of inequality at the tehsil level using this small area estimation technique. And it's interesting to point out that the patterns are not necessarily identical. We do not necessarily see high poverty rates and high inequality rates always correlated perfectly with each other. And so these maps are quite different in terms of where they're pointing to pockets of high poverty or pockets of high inequality. One of the findings that comes out of that exercise, and it's an important one, I think, for the purpose of this discussion today, is that we really shouldn't assume that poor villages are somehow less unequal than rich villages, that there's somehow everybody's poor in the poor villages, and it's only in the rich villages that you observe inequality. In fact, if you look at the different states here, you can see that the poorest villages have inequality rates that are on average not any lower than the rich villages. In the case of Orissa, in the middle here, you can see that the actual poorest quintile of villages actually have a distribution of inequality that's actually higher than the richest quintile of villages. Inequality seems to be particularly high in the poor villages. This is sometimes at odds with how people often think about the spatial distribution of poverty and inequality. It's often felt that, oh, the poor communities, everybody's equally poor, and the rich communities is where we observe differentiation between some who are richer than others and so on. The picture here is that we really shouldn't presume that poor tehsils are more equal than non-poor tehsils. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because we observe throughout the world, and I believe this is true also in India, a clear process towards greater decentralization, where local communities are involved in the identification, the design, the financing, the implementation of a variety of projects and so on. Community-driven development is an approach that's being really widely implemented throughout the world. And the idea is that local communities know best what kind of projects would work best in those communities and so on. The worry, once we layer onto that sort of reasoning the possibility of inequality, is that we could then be entering into a situation where local communities and their choices and their preferences are captured by local elites. And then that these local elites are the ones who actually turn the development initiatives that are directed at them to their particular advantage, and possibly not to the advantage of the less well-off in those villages. Now, of course, whether there is elite capture or not is an empirical question, but it seems likely that it's going to be correlated with the extent to which there's inequality at the local level. Those communities which have a higher level of inequality are likely also to be the ones where this issue of elite capture is likely to be more pronounced. Now, what are the consequences of elite capture? This is something that's an area of ongoing research in a variety of different settings, and it's one that's well worth pursuing carefully, and it's likely to be different. The experience will be different in different contexts. But I was involved in one study where we looked at this particular question in the case of Ecuador. And the idea here was we had a social fund project, which is something like a government program aimed at community-driven development, where resources are made available to communities, and the communities have to choose from a menu of possible projects that they would like to implement. In the case of this Ecuadorian example, the communities could choose between upgrading the village square or improving the lighting that was available in the village, and also improving the latrine facilities that were available in the village. And there was a number of other projects that could be chosen. And it seems likely, given the circumstances of the poor, that a project such as the latrine project would be one that would be particularly preferred by the poorest households in these villages, while the richer households in these villages were much more likely to have already installed flush toilets, or at least upgraded sanitation services in their households. It turns out that in this particular context in Ecuador, we were able to document that the more unequal communities, controlling for their poverty rate, were less likely to choose the latrine project. So this is saying that if we take two villages that are equally poor, the more unequal community would be less likely to select that project that is likely to be particularly important to the poorest in the village. So we see this in this picture here, that the larger the share of total expenditure received by the top 1% in the village, it's a kind of a measure of elites, the extent to which there are elites in the village, the extent of elite power in the village, the less likely they were going to choose this latrine project, a project that would be particularly valuable to the poor. So it's an example here of how an intervention aimed at sort of development at the local level could be kind of turned away from the poorest members of the village towards those who were less disadvantaged. So it's an example of how this elite capture can influence policy and policy interventions at the local level. Now, how important is village inequality in India? Now, as I've already mentioned, this is difficult to document, and we only have this one pilot project so far in the states of Andhra Pradesh, Orissa, and West Bengal that was carried out some 20-25 years ago to kind of produce these local granular level estimates of inequality across a very large spatial area. And we certainly don't have a map of local inequality for the country as a whole. But there has been some work that's been done to try to at least get a sense of how important is local inequality likely to be in the all India context. And this is basically carried out by a study by Garces Urzanki and Mukhopadhyay that was published in 2022. The idea here was that they took NSS data from 2004 and 2011, and they calculated inequality at the national level. So this is what the NSS can definitely support. So you can produce estimates of inequality at the all India level. And they carried it out at the all India level as well as between urban and in rural areas. You then use remote sensing data and the NSS data in combination to estimate average per capita consumption in each village. That's something that these remote sensing data have been able to be used for. Capturing the degree of dispersion within the village is not yet something that these remote sensing data have been able to demonstrably be used for, but they have been shown to be allow a reasonably accurate estimate of average overall per capita consumption at the level of each village. So they use those remote sensing data to calculate the average per capita consumption level for every village in India. They then asked how much of total inequality in India is due to these differences in average per capita consumption across villages. And so that's this component B. Component A that they calculated was the national inequality, and the component B was the contribution of between village inequality in terms of between average income consumption levels across villages. Then taking the difference of total inequality minus between village inequality gives us a sense of how important within inequality is. And in their table, they find that something both in 2004 and 2011, something well above 70% of total inequality can be attributed to inequality that occurs within villages. This is obtained in this local within inequality row in this table. In rural areas, it's about 74, 75%. In urban areas, it's above that. In urban areas, most of inequality occurs within urban blocks, as opposed to across urban blocks. And so inequality on the basis of this exercise is clearly something that's a very big part of total inequality is attributable to inequalities that exist within the villages of India. What they haven't been able to demonstrate in the studies, of course, have been able to allow us to actually individually investigate the level of inequality in every particular village in turn in India. But we've been able to, on the basis of this exercise, get a sense of how important within village inequality is likely to be in a country like India. And it seems to be a very large component of total inequality. This means, of course, that if we're interested in addressing inequality in India, we're going to have to think about addressing inequality at the local level and being able to engage with the factors and the forces that drive inequality at the very local level. So I'd like to turn now, following from this sort of broader discussion, to the much more granular discussion of one village that I happen to be familiar with alongside Professor Himanshu and various additional collaborators, where we've been following the economic development in a village in Uttar Pradesh between 1957 all the way up to 2015. And indeed, when I was last in India only a few weeks ago, Dr. Himanshu and I were able to visit Palampur yet again, just for a quick visit. So it's an ongoing project of tracking and investigating what's going on in the context of one single village in India. So I propose to go through quite quickly this village study and basically document what we've been observing with respect, in particular, to the evolution of inequality in the village. So the village is located in Moradabad district in Uttar Pradesh. It's a small village with agriculture as the primary economic source of economic activity. Wheat, paddy, and sugarcane are the primary crops that are produced. There's a diverse caste structure in the village. It's been surveyed 7 times, once in each decade since independence. The village was originally chosen by Nicholas Stern and Christopher Bliss, two British economists who basically started this Palanpur project. They chose to visit the village and spend a year living in the village in 1974-75, having determined that the village had been studied previously by the Agricultural Economics Research Center at the Delhi School of Economics in 1957 and 1962. So they had some previous data already. They lived in the village for roughly a year. The village was chosen because it wasn't too far away from Delhi, and they had some obligations at the Indian Statistical Institute at the time, so they could travel back and forth from time to time. But clearly it's not a village that's in the shadow of Delhi. It takes roughly, certainly at the time, it took roughly a day to get between Delhi and Palanpur. They were interested in studying the Green Revolution at the time. And so they were interested in villages that had wheat cultivation, which was one of the primary crops that had been affected by the Green Revolution technologies. And they were also interested in understanding tenancy relations. And so they were interested in a village where sharecropping and other tenancy relations were a part of the agricultural landscape. The village itself is not particularly unusual in any respect, and that was also important because they didn't want the village to stand out in any particular way. Of course, at the same time, there's nothing about Palanpur which will allow one to say that what's observed in Palanpur necessarily is true everywhere else in the country either. The villages were studied in the years 1957, 1962, 1974, 1983, 1993, until 2008, and most recently 2015. And these years that were where there was really a concentrated effort to collect data in the village were years that also corresponded to different agricultural harvests, so good years, bad years, and so on. The village, oh, the picture doesn't show, sorry, when I blew up this picture, it didn't, the circle didn't capture where the village is, but it's located in Moradabad district. So it's not far from Moradabad in Uttar Pradesh. The population of the village in 1957, there was just over 500 households in the village, or 500 people, roughly 100 households, and the population had grown to 1,300 villagers and more than 220 households by 2015. Population growth rates have been more or less similar to the all India growth rates. There's not much on the demographic side that makes Palanpur stand out in any particular way in terms of its trends over time. Income per capita has grown in real terms quite considerably, and this is tracked also by the very considerable declining rates of poverty that we've been able to document. So the village has advanced over time from an economic perspective, with poverty declining from a very high rate of nearly 80 or nearly 90% of the village population to something well over, just a little bit over a third of the population poor in 2008, 2009. I'm not including 2015 in this table because our income data was not as complete that we had in the 2015 survey year. And so wherever we use income, we will confine our attention to the range, to the period 1957 to 2008. Inequality, as you can see in the third row, is sort of stabilized, was kind of plateauing, was basically bouncing around a little bit between 0.27 in 74 and 0.35 in 1962. Until 2008, 2009, where we see that it has actually increased. So from 1983 to 2008, there was quite a significant increase in the Gini coefficient. So the general impression is that inequality has increased, has risen in the village, particularly in the last 2 survey years. The village experienced, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, considerable agricultural intensification, and that's documented here in the wheat yields that have been really dramatically improving over time. Okay, again, in terms of annual growth rates of income and so on, Palanpur hasn't really grown at a rate that's dramatically different than what we've observed at the, say, all India, or certainly at the all UP level. Here is the picture that I was describing in terms of the yields. Agricultural productions has improved dramatically. Wheat in particular has seen the largest growth, and that has continued after, between 1983 and 2008, even though the Green Revolution technologies were particularly strongly felt and most influential in the 60s and the early 1970s. The reason this agricultural intensification occurred was because basically agricultural intensification continued after the new seed varieties and fertilizers and other inputs had been introduced as part of the Green Revolution via mechanization and so on. And so we see the irrigation, combination of irrigation, high yield varieties, mechanization, and so on has allowed cropping intensity in the village to increase dramatically and to continue increasing over time. Multiple crops per year, whereas in the early 1950s, there was essentially one crop per year. With the Green Revolution, that turned into double cropping. And now in the village, there are actually several households that are doing triple crops per year. Mechanization has been a very big part of the agricultural transformation process. Pumping sets, tractors have become available. Pumping sets have become widely used. The Persian wheel has kind of disappeared from usage as having been replaced by pumping sets. And so we see a very clear trend of increasing capital intensity of agriculture. This has released labor. So there's less people involved on cultivating their own fields. There's more hired labor as well. It's become more of a transacted rather than just a household subsistence farming type of activity. It's a more commercialized labor market in the agricultural sector as well. So since the Green Revolution and the increased agricultural intensification, there's been alongside that also a process of diversification out of agriculture in the village. This echoes very much the Director General's remarks about the village that he studied in Rajasthan with the cement factory. In Palampur too, there have been a variety of non-agricultural employment opportunities that have made their way into the region around Palampur, allowing villagers to engage in non-agricultural activities. Bread factory, there's two nearby towns, the city of Moradabad, the town of Chandosi, that are all relatively nearby. There's been improved connectivity, road access is improved, rail access is improved, so people are often commuting to nearby source places of employment. Much of the work that in the non-farm sector is not regular employment, but is largely casual, daily employment or short-term employment, rather than sort of salaried long-term employment. Commuting has become very common in the Palampur context. A lot of the villagers will actually leave the village in the morning and then come back in the evening, having worked somewhere outside of the village in some non-agricultural activity. There's been some important implications of this non-farm diversification. In particular, one of the the more deprived castes in the village, the Jats, have experienced a sort of improved bargaining power and have become more involved in the non-farm sector and outside jobs, rather than their historical employment as agricultural laborers. Supervision of agricultural activities become more costly, and this non-farm diversification process has also clearly had an impact on poverty and contributing to this poverty reduction that has been observed in Palampur, despite the fact that the population has been growing over time and the overall land availability has been fixed in supply. Poverty has continued falling, and that's to a large extent thanks to this diversification process. But as we've seen, this has also been accompanied by this rising inequality in the village. Most of the households in the village now have more than one source of income. So there's an increase in this pluriactivity. So you have one family member that's still involved in agriculture, others that are engaged in some of these non-agricultural activities that are available. So you can see that the number of income sources has increased over time. Non-farm income, as we can see here, has increased dramatically over time, alongside sort of decline in some of the relative importance of cultivation income. So between 1983 and 2008, cultivation income declined in importance from 50% of the village income to 30%. And this was accompanied at the same time by non-farm income increasing from 30% to 46%. So there's been if we look at the 2008 year, roughly half of total village income comes from non-agricultural sources, and just a little bit over half is still due to cultivation. It's a village that's not just an agricultural village anymore. It's one where both non-farm as well as farm incomes are a very important part of the village economy. We can see the employment in non-farm in the non-farm sector has increased quite steadily over time. All the way up to 2015, there was a small dip in 1993, but with one of the factories in the vicinity having closed down at the time of that survey year. But by 2008, 2009, the non-agricultural employment had resumed, and it's at its peak in 2015. Occupational patterns, we can see again, have been very much in the direction of non-farm employment. There's been a decline in cultivation and livestock as a principal occupation, and accompanied by a considerable increase in the casual non-farm employment over time. What's interesting to note is that regular non-farm employment hasn't really dramatically increased over time. It's been some increase, but it hasn't really been a dramatic increase. So the non-farm sector is one that's quite precarious in the sense that it's mainly casual, informal sector employment that's been driving the diversification in the village. We have in the village three main castes. At the very top of the village hierarchy is the caste called the Thakoors. And they've been seeing quite a sort of this pluriactivity is something that's very clearly noticeable in the case of the Thakoors. They've been engaging in a variety of different activities, some cultivation, but clearly also non-farm activities. And in particular, they are highly represented among those with regular non-farm employment. A second group in the village is the Maraos, who are traditional farmers, a farming caste, and they've remained heavily concentrated in farming as their principal occupation. There's some expansion of non-agricultural activities as well. This is not surprising given that population pressure is leading to declining per capita land holdings. So there is some need for even the Marao households to look outside of agriculture in order to maintain their income levels. But their inclination remains focused on agriculture. And that's something that we can see here in the cultivation and livestock employment figures. Finally, the Jatabs, as I already mentioned, they're at the very bottom of the hierarchy, of the caste hierarchy in the village, and they've seen a considerable increase in participation in casual non-farm employment, working in the brick kilns in the vicinity of Palampur and other sort of relatively unattractive, unappealing, but still non-agricultural occupations. And their involvement in agriculture has declined quite precipitously since the 50s and the 1960s. So as I've already noted, poverty has fallen quite steadily, and average incomes have increased quite steadily. We really have two periods that we document in Palampur. The first period being one of agricultural intensification, with irrigation and with the expansion of modern inputs and so on, and the use of tractors and increased mechanization. And this process basically led to falling income inequality. Then we saw the expansion of non-agricultural activities, resulting in non-farm activities and rising average incomes, continued falling poverty, but then a rise in inequality. Okay, and one of the things that, from one perspective, it seems as though this structural transformation process in Palampur has been quite good from a distributional perspective. The rise of these Jats, this ability for them to engage into the non-agricultural sector, has been good and has helped drive these declines in poverty. But at the same time, we've also documented an increase in overall income inequality. And in fact, if we take advantage of our long-term data and we look at issues such as intergenerational mobility, then our picture actually becomes much more nuanced. The picture is there is this two-way relationship between inequality and income mobility that we've been able to document. And I'll come back to that in just a second. So here's the evidence on different measures of inequality. We've already talked about the Gini coefficient, but the basic trends are supported also by other measures that one might wish to employ. If we look at what this has implied in terms of mobility in the village, you can see in this figure here, what we've done is we've looked at the caste breakdown of the village, and then we've basically categorized them into a different set of welfare sort of categories, roughly quintiles of the village welfare distribution. What we've taken here is a very explicitly very broad notion of welfare. We've not based it only on economic indicators such as income, but we're also looking at things like lifestyle, and looking at things like intra-household distribution and all kinds of things like that. And what you can see is that in 1983-84, when the village was just emerging from the sort of agricultural intensification period and beginning to move strongly in the direction of non-farm diversification. At that time, the Muraos, this farming caste, were very highly represented amongst the richest segments of the village population, and the Jatabs were very clearly located at the bottom end of the village income distribution or welfare distribution. If we look in 2008, 2009, the picture has changed. The Muraos have become more evenly spread. Their inclination to farm over any other occupation has turned out not to be as helpful to them, because much of the impetus behind economic development in the village is now coming from the non-agricultural sector. And we see that has resulted also in the Jatabs being able to move up in the village welfare rankings. So there's a clear example of sort of caste mobility amongst the different castes that has occurred as this village process of non-farm diversification has taken hold. But the one downside of all of this, or one worrying development that we've been able to ascertain, is that we've documented a sort of decline in intergenerational mobility. So what we did is we calculated the relationship, the elasticity of income between households in, say, 2008, 2009, and the incomes of their fathers in the early first stages of our longitudinal study. So if you look at the elasticity of income between 1957 and 1983-84, and then between 1983-84 and 2008-2009, what we see is that the intergenerational elasticity has actually increased over time. What this is telling us is that there is an increase in intergenerational immobility. There's a decline in mobility across generations over time. And this seems particularly strong when we have high inequality. So when the Gini coefficient is high, when you have a high inequality society, then it looks as though you have less mobility than when you have low inequality. In the period 1957-1983, the inequality in 1957 was lower, and it led to a lower intergenerational elasticity, which implies greater mobility across generations. In 1983-84, the Gini coefficient was nearly 0.38, and looking at the elasticity intergenerational elasticity between 1983 and 2008, 2009, we see that it's higher, which means that in fact there's less mobility. So what we're documenting here is what's often called the Great Gatsby curve, which suggests that there is, as a community becomes more unequal, this is associated with lower mobility across generations. And since mobility across generations is an important sort of indicator of opportunity, the evidence seems to suggest that accompanying this process of high rising inequality in Palampur has been a process of declining opportunities. It's more and more difficult today for villagers to sort of improve their circumstances and to do better than, say, their parents did than it was at a time when inequality was lower. And that's a worrying development from the point of view of sort of welfare that we've seen. Alongside, although we do document falling poverty, and we do document rising average incomes, there is this worrying development of possibly rising immobility, increased immobility across generations. So that's where I wanted to end my remarks. Just to recap, local inequality is often statistically invisible. We do have some methods that allow us to assess that, to get a window on what could be happening at the level of local village, local communities. It's not just a problem that accrues to rich villages. Even poor villages are struggling with the possible high levels of inequality. When you have these high levels of inequality, you fall prey to the risk of elite capture, and that could influence and frustrate development initiatives. It seems that in India, village level inequality is quite important from a quantitative perspective. And what we've been able to document in Palampur is that there's been a really significant process of structural change over time. We've seen economic growth and poverty reduction. We've seen diversification of employment and occupations. We've seen a greater integration of the village with the broader economy via commuting and so on. We've seen persistent, however, and possibly even increasing income inequality. And there's some evidence, therefore, of a declining mobility across generations. And that's something to be concerned about. What kind of policy interventions might one consider in light of this kind of development in a village such as Palampur? Well, we could think of certain targeted transfers like widows' pensions that seem to be, would be particularly valuable in Palampur. Self-targeting mechanisms, like say employed by the NREGA employment scheme, could be of potential value when they're well run and well financed. Improving access to public services, schooling and healthcare remains a priority in the village, where these services are still far from as one would like. And improving further this access to and to jobs outside the village seems to be something that would be quite an important part of the development process in Palampur going forward. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I haven't taken too much time, and I look forward very much to hearing the sort of remarks from my colleague, Dr. Himanshu, who can certainly elaborate to a much greater extent than I can on what's been going on in Palampur. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lanjouw. Thank you so much for your presentation. We will have an introduction session combined at the end after Dr. Himanshu's presentation. So we would now like to invite Dr. Himanshu to present his findings from Palampur. You would like to unmute, sir? I have given you the host controls, so you should be able to. Yeah.
Okay, let me now see how do I present.
In the panel below, there is a box with an arrow sign, so that will allow you to share your screen.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Yeah, can you see this?
It takes some time to sync. Yes. Yes, it's visible.
So, first of all, thanks to NI and Ruchira for working together, me and PT, on this important
just
issue.
One request, please put it on the full screen mode, because we can see the file but not the presentation. If you share your full screen and then minimize the Google Meet, you will be able to see the presentation.
Okay, let me do this then.
The option your entire screen and then minimizing your Google window. You will start your presentation. We will be able to see it.
So you want me to make it full screen and then take that screen?
Go to present now and then select your entire screen. Then minimize the Google Meet window and then open the presentation at your end.
Is it visible now?
Yes, it's syncing now.
Do I make it full slide?
Slide mode. Yes.
Hello?
So the slideshow is not visible. We can see the file.
Is it? Okay, now can you see that? At least something is visible.
We can see the PPT, sir. So if you just
we should
zoom
go
in a
ahead.
little bit, yeah, and then
Ruchira, I think we should go ahead. It's, I think, pretty visible. Even in this mode, it is visible. We could go ahead.
yes, sir. So using the file, you can navigate, and we'll go ahead.
So can you see the?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah.
Now we can
Okay.
see. Thank you.
Let me. Okay, so I think a lot of what I wanted to say has already been said by Peter, and that's something which is good because it saves some amount of effort on my part. Now, what I wanted to do was to basically continue in a larger context of what India at this point of time. Understanding particularly in the last 10 years, the decade, is something which will be helpful for us to analyze or understand what is going on in the rural areas, particularly in Palanpur and other villages. Now, villages continue to be important. Rural areas are important, and not just for domestic demand and economic growth, but also I think for poverty and inequality, which remain a big challenge for us. I think we are still, despite all the claims, we are still a country with a very significant poverty, and which is definitely at least in the last 10 to 15. Some of them have been a result of natural shocks. For example, we had a drought in 2014 and 15, and then the COVID pandemic, for example.
The voice is breaking. Someone take care.
Is it better now?
Sir, if you switch off your video, then maybe it will stream better because there is a connectivity problem.
Okay, let me see. Is it better now?
Yes, sir. Please.
Okay. Now, so that's something which is important to keep in mind, that we had two major natural shocks. We had a double drought in 14 and 15, and we had the COVID pandemic, which kind of aggravated the distress which was already there because of various reasons. Some of them obviously were man-made, and we had the demonetization and the GST rollout, which had an impact on the informal sector, particularly in the rural areas. We'll come back to that a little later. But as of now, I just wanted to give a brief overview of what exactly is going on in the economy. Now, this is something which we all know, that we have been actually going through a period when, since 2016-17, the Indian economy has been going through a period of a sharp slowdown. I mean, our growth rates really came down from more than 8% in 2016-17 to less than 4%, roughly around 3.5%. That was before pandemic in 1920. I mean, obviously, after the pandemic, things haven't been very well, and it has affected almost every section of the society, both in the rural areas as well as in the urban areas, people at the bottom end of the distribution, but also people who are relatively well off. And I think that is something which is likely to have an impact on how do we see the role that the villages are going to play, not just in the current context of inequality, but also in terms of reviving growth and reviving demand in the economy. But a large part of the economy in that sense was protected, and particularly the agricultural sector. And that's something which is true. Even during the period of the slowdown, we didn't have agriculture which was going into a collapse. And that was one sector which actually held on. and it continued to have a reasonably good kind of a growth, even though there was mild deceleration in the growth rate of agricultural sector. But that is something which is slightly deceptive. In fact, if you break down the agricultural sector into which sectors where growth is happening, then you do realize that in the agricultural sector, where we're talking about the broader agricultural sector, is the crop sector, which actually was not doing very well. The crop sector is the second panel that you see, the bars that you see. And there is a sharp slowdown in the crop sector, which is when majority of the people are actually employed. Livestock, forestry, and fishing and aquaculture were the ones which were really driving well. But the crop sector, which employs roughly 2/3 of the total population employed in agriculture, that sector has actually seen almost negligible growth. And that is again a kind of inequality that continues to provide some kind of an answer as to why the rural areas continue to be in distress. The information on distributional outcomes we don't have. An aggregate GDP is unlikely to give us a much greater granularity on who is benefiting out of the great growth and who is losing out of it. But the only information we had on this count was the consumption survey of 2017-18, which unfortunately the government decided not to use it. But the report was leaked, and we have some information available of that. And that basically showed the crisis in the situation in the rural areas, also in the urban areas, where you can see that the monthly per capita expenditure declined in the rural areas between 2011-12 to 17-18. Although it increased in the urban areas. So you can see that the rural areas were actually the ones who are suffering the brunt of the decline in consumption expenditure. Overall consumption expenditure declined, but it was the rural areas which basically were, and this has happened in the first time in the last 6 decades that we can look at it. One implication of that was obviously that this decline in rural areas in monthly per capita consumption expenditure led to increase in poverty. But the decline in real consumption in rural areas is not something which is coming from only the leaked data. Even the published information that we have, and if you look at the comparable numbers, that appears to be more or less a confirmed fact that there was a decline in the real monthly per capita consumption expenditure. Poverty obviously would have gone up, and it did go up, but where did it go up? And that is where I think the inequality is very clear. It was basically going up in the rural areas, and quite substantially, not so much in the urban areas where it actually declined. So we had the rural areas who were basically suffering the brunt of overall slowdown, as well as the distress that was coming in the rural economy because of the drought and various other factors. And I'm not getting into it, but just to highlight that rural areas continue to be dominant, continue to be important for both growth, poverty reduction, inequality, and everything, are the ones who didn't have a very good time in the last 10 years or decade or so. This trend has continued, and we have information that is coming from the PLFS data, which again suggests that incomes from workers, which is all employment, self-employment, regular and casual, has continued to decline even after 2017-18 up to 2020-21, that information. And that is something which confirms from, is further confirmed from consumption expenditure. So we are talking about almost a decade from 2011-12 to 2020-21, where a majority of the data that, at least the official data, shows that incomes have been going down, consumption expenditure has been going down, and it certainly will have an impact on what is going on in terms of the rural economy, both in agriculture as well as the non-agriculture sector, a point that Peter has already pointed out, that this is a sector which has become very important. I mean, obviously, there are other private sources of data which have been giving the same kind of a picture, but I'm not getting into that picture. But just to tell you and bring it the other part of the story, which is the employment story. And that is a story which now is more or less well known, that we are really in a period where we are calling it as jobless growth, or we're calling it as serious issue of employment creation or job creation. Unemployment rates have gone up quite substantially, and they are at a level of which is almost the highest since the data is available from 77-78. But that is not the only thing. I think that is something which is missing the real picture. What we do see are two important indicators, and I'm going to put them together. One is what we have seen is the decline in women workers, which was there from 2004-5 up to 2017-18. That is a process which seems to have reversed, which is that more number of women are now joining the workforce. Where are they joining? They're mostly joining in agriculture and in rural areas. And that reversal is something which is may not be a good sign if you're looking at the previous literature and we go look at the evidence that we had from the 99 to 2004-5 period, where women employment increase, particularly in rural areas and in agriculture, is generally associated with the kind of rural distress that was there in 99 to 2004-5 period. The second important fact, which is unemployment much less talked about, is what we are seeing is some kind of a reversal of the structural transformation that was visible after 2004-5, when we had the absolute number of workers in agriculture going down. Now that is a number which has actually shown a reversal, and we now have workers going back to agriculture, and number of workers in agriculture is actually increasing. Now, after COVID, obviously, a lot of people went back to agriculture and they have continued to stay back. That data is not here. But if you add that, we now have a situation where we are seeing a reversal of the structural transformation process in the economy, something which is going to have a repercussion in the long run. What happened to incomes? We know that incomes have remained more or less stagnant in the last 10 years. After growing for about 7% between 2008 to 13, last 5-7 years, the real wages have remained flat, almost flat. In non-agricultural sector, there has been some decline, but overall, if you look at it, real wages have been stagnant, and that is a period of 7 years, which is the longest period when real wages have not increased. And I think it hasn't happened in the last 4 to 5 decades. So there is obviously a serious crisis as far as incomes are concerned, but it is not just the casual and daily wage laborers whose incomes have stagnated. Even the regular workers, both in rural areas as well as in urban areas, have seen their real incomes decline. And this is coming from your National Sample Survey employment and unemployment data and the PLFS data. And you can see the 11 to 18 period where real wages have declined much more in the urban areas, but even in the rural areas, there has not been any increase except in the rural female category where there is a marginal improvement as far as wages are concerned. So I think all of this is pointing out to the kind of a crisis that is there in the rural areas of income, of access to various employment jobs which are available in the non-agricultural sector. And this is a much larger question, and maybe the data is not enough for us to be able to have a good idea of whether the trend is likely to continue or not. But it does point out to the seriousness of the kind of distress that is there in the rural areas. This is something which is on self-employed workers, which is farmers' income. And this is clearly evident now that even though agriculture continues to perform well, roughly around 3.5% rate of growth, including in the current year, it hasn't translated into farmers' income going up. And that is simply because the cost of cultivation has gone up, and therefore the workers' income, which is the profit margin, is not something which is showing the same kind of an increase as the overall agricultural GDP. So if you're in the rural areas, if your cultivators' incomes are not going up, if your casual wage workers' incomes are not going up, if your regular workers' incomes are not going up, then I don't think this is something which is very surprising that poverty has gone up, and that also substantially. So we are seeing a situation where things appear to be a little bit problematic as far as the rural economy is concerned. And since the talk is about whether the villages are going to prosper and in what ways, I think the overall context in which the rural economy is currently situated needs to be factored in when we talk about what impact it will have and what inequality plays a role in terms of reviving demand or reviving the rural economy. The two other important information that I wanted to share, one was the NREGA, which used to be an important measure of what is happening to, in terms of protection to the rural workers. That also has witnessed a decline in real wages. And now it is much lower than the private casual wages. And this is true almost every state, barring 1 or 2 states, where the wages in the NREGA is now almost same as the casual private wages. In almost every state, NREGA wages are lower than the private casual wages. Even then, the demand for NREGA wages have gone up, demand for NREGA work has gone up, and the amount of work that is being allocated on NREGA has also, at least in the last 2 years, has gone up. Now that shows that people are willing to work at wages which are much lower than the private casual market, where you can go and get it in the agricultural sector or the non-agricultural sector, simply because there are no jobs available. Now that is the situation, and but even then NREGA has seen an increase in expenditure, increase in employment demanded, increase in work that is being done by workers. What does it mean for inequality? Now, obviously, there is some inference that we can find out that there is a crisis in the economy, at least in the rural economy. Some of it may have worsened after COVID. But what is surprising is that at least the aggregate data suggests that inequality may not have gone up. So the same information that we had from the same consumption surveys and the same income surveys also suggest that actually inequality has gone down in the rural areas. From the Gini coefficient has come down, both in the rural as well as in the urban areas. And that is where the real issue is. How is it that inequality has continued to decline, aggregate level, not at the local level, in the villages, in the rural areas, whereas incomes have been declining and poverty is going up? We will say a little bit about this, but let me just continue with that. And this is something which is a trend which is confirmed from other sources as well. We don't have the data, and we are actually talking about a period where we are completely, and I think this is a point that needs to be made, which is that since 2011-12, we are really groping in the dark. Our statistical system has failed. We don't have any consumption survey, which is where we could get information. There are a lot of work that Peter showed from small area estimation to others require the kind of large scale data that is unfortunately not available. Even the census information is not available, which is what could have been a useful tool for us to figure out and look at what is happening in the rural areas in much more granularity and much more disaggregated level. But if you try and get some kind of an information on what is happening to income of various category of workers, and this is something which I've calculated from the national accounts figures, where various category of workers are and their incomes, what has happened. It's a long-term time series from 93-94 to 2021, the last year for which information is available. Now, the last three lines that you see are the lowest one, orange one, is the agricultural wages. And just above that are the non-agricultural wages and the self-employed in agriculture, self-employed in agriculture, which is the cultivators class. As you can see, there has been almost like staying in parallel, not much of a difference. On the other hand, the self-employed in non-agriculture, the business community, private businesses, they were doing quite well, at least since 2004-5 onwards. Their incomes were growing quite well up to 2019-20, and then it started declining. The top two are the private organized sector salaried class, and the top one is the government sector salaried class, whose incomes are protected because they're indexed by inflation. What does it mean overall? And we are in a situation, the overall context, and I'm repeating that context is because we are still not out of the situation. We are in a situation where there is a likelihood that growth is likely to slow down further. Inequality may have declined, but it is driven by depressed incomes of the middle groups or even the lower section of the populations, wage workers and cultivators. And we really don't know whether the increase in poverty is likely to sustain or we are going to see a reversal of the trend. But the good news is that some of the people in the bottom end of the distribution have actually been protected, particularly during the COVID regime, through various social transfer programs, including the public distribution system and the NREGA, despite the fact that they are not sufficient. They are not enough to take care of the kind of distress that is there. Now, that is the overall context. And in which I wanted to come back to the story, which is where Peter was in terms of Palanpur story. And fortunately, he has covered the details a little bit, so I'm not going to go into details of these ones. So this is something which you know, what is the village and how we studied it. We have done it, and the current survey, which is there in 2022, which we have done after COVID, just to look at what is the impact of COVID and what impact it had on the village incomes and employment. Not yet been able to process the data and come up with our findings, but our own impression from going to the villages does appear to confirm what we have seen earlier, that things are improving, but we also see some evidence of public services collapsing. We also see some evidence of employment becoming a big crisis in the rural economy. There is, not to say that there has not been any improvement. There is obviously an improvement that you can see. There are more number of motorcycles, there are a few cars, tractors are there, TV is there, mobile phones is now almost everywhere there in the village. But despite all of this, you can't basically say that Palanpur has is no longer a poor village. It is still a very, very poor village, and one visual impression, if you go to the village itself, is enough to give you the impression that it is a village which continues to remain very poor despite the advance or despite the increase in incomes and assets that has come to the village in the last 6 to 7 decades. Now, what we are interested is not in the overall level of inequality or lower level of income in the village. What I'm going to really emphasize on what exactly does it mean in terms of inequality in the village. What kind of processes are unleashed, or what kind of change or dynamics that operates when inequality is higher or inequality is lower. Now, two things which Peter has highlighted, and I'm just going to reiterate that the process of green revolution brought in huge amount of changes in the village. The agricultural incomes went up, and it also led to some amount of decline in inequality. But the period, which is the post-1980s period, 90s onwards particularly, is a period which has been driven mostly by non-farm activities. And that is also a period when we see some evidence of inequality going up. And that is because of the nature of the non-farm activities, which more or less we have been looking at as a homogeneous entity, but it is not, simply because it includes a variety of activities that have been clubbed together as one single part of it. Most of these are informal and not in the regular kind of a job, or not a very good organized part of it, but small scale enterprises. But even there, to access those services, you need some kind of capital, you need some kind of a network, you need some kind of both network and capital as well as connections to be able to take advantage of that. And that is where the inequalities have been brought in. The Jats, who were much less dependent on agriculture, were much more ready to take opportunities outside agricultural sector, and they went out of the village as well to look at whatever job is available. And that did improve the condition of the Jats compared to the Muraus, who are generally did better in the first half and generally much more skilled as far as agriculture is concerned. But it also is a question where the various communities have responded to the opening of the opportunities in a different way. Some have benefited, but a large part of them are still likely to be, may not have benefited to the extent that one would like to be. If you look at the village economy, I mean, this is something which we have been talked about, and I'm not going to spend much time on this. Pluri-activity is a kind of an insurance, kind of a mechanism, what we call as a portfolio diversification strategy, simply because the uncertainties in agriculture as well as the non-agricultural sector continue to remain important. And the pluri-activity in that sense protects the farmers or protect the village residents from a crisis. So in many cases, when the agriculture sector is in crisis, it is the non-agriculture sector which acts as a sponge, absorbs the shock and provides them some kind of a relief. This is what has been happening in the village. But what we do see now in the last 5 to 6 years, when we went to the village this time and comparing with the 2015, we do see that at least while agriculture is something which is much less vulnerable to shocks, the non-agricultural sector continues to be ridden with various kind of shocks, both policy induced as well as the market linked, greater linkages to the markets. So overall, the numbers have been there. These have been presented, and I'm not getting into the details of how it has changed. But what we do observe, and this is a point that Peter has reiterated, that inequality has an important role in mobility. How do generations move from one section of the, where they're located in the income spectrum in the present generation to the next generation? That is determined a lot by what is happening to inequality. Caste plays an important role. Networks play an important role. Access to education plays an important role. And your opportunities that are opened up by the village economy, but also outside the village economy, play an important role. And they are not uniform. There is a relationship that exists between inequality and mobility. Higher inequality is likely to lead to lower mobility, whereas a lower inequality situation is likely to lead to more mobility. And we do see that kind of situation in the village. But the second part, which is important in the village particularly, is the issue of intergenerational income mobility and social mobility, both of which we find that are important, and we see some kind of a movement as far as intergenerational mobility is concerned. But again, it is not the same for all castes. Some castes have seen much more mobility, whereas some castes have not seen that level of mobility. Moraos are a good example of a caste which is stuck in wherever they are among the highest income group, but they are the ones who have seen the least mobility, whereas the Jats and to a certain extent the Thakurs have seen much larger mobility. This you have already seen, so I'm not going to analyze more on that. But the other point I wanted to highlight, and which is a point which complements the issue of elite capture that Peter was talking about, is the issue of what is the role of inequality in terms of human development, institutions, and the social structure. Obviously, inequality operates in the village in different ways. And what we see in the village is over a period of 7 decades, there is obviously a lot of changes which are happening in different institutional structures, social structures, economic structures, but also a lot of things remain the same. So there is an inertia which is there. Inequality is very much linked to what kind of opportunities are opened up, who benefits from those opportunities, how do people respond to those opportunities. But where it has a very strong impact, and something which we are struggling with, is in terms of the role of public services and collective action. In the village, even though incomes have grown and there has been assets, you can see there is in prosperity that is visible, the village is something which continues to be beset with really bad public services. The health system is really bad. There is no public health facility nearby. There's one public health center which was opened up that closed down very soon. Schools are really in bad situation. Teachers were not available for a large part of the survey period that we were there in 2008 to 10, although now there are one or two teachers who have come. And private sector is really the one which is leading the charge as far as the health is concerned. Almost 90% of outpatient treatment is in the private sector, and almost 85% are there in the inpatient healthcare. But it's not just health and education. Every institution, for example, the village had a seed store and there was a cooperative bank. Both of them have more or less collapsed. The seed store building is almost collapsed in the sense it was something which was a very good role model of cooperative that was brought in the village. But inequality has meant that the richer people or those who have any kind of a wealth or connection, they are unlikely to be invested in making sure that these public institutions continue to remain important for the village. The nexus, it has led to a kind of a cronyism, where there is a nexus between the institutional and the non-institutional agents. And the inequality is something which has helped this kind of a nexus to become stronger and stronger over a period of time. It has led to the poorer people going into a different kind of social arrangements, piece rate contracts and various exchange kind of labor, which again is where the inequality or the kind of collective voice which had led to some kind of a uniform way of labor arrangement that is breaking down. We have also seen entry of chit funds, the Ponzi schemes, and all sorts of private agents, and they have moved into the village, where again the poor people have been defrauded and have been cheated, and because of luring of various promises, and all of these things have happened. But it is the public services where these things are much visible. You will see the village school; it is in bad shape. There is, for a large period of time, there was no midday meal that was happening in the village. But despite that, there is no collective action in the village. The ICDS center doesn't function. The pension scheme is in shambles. The NREGA, there is no massive outrage, or even it is not working for months. And these are all suffering from neglect. But there is no collective action. And the inequality, the lack of collective action is simply because the richer people have simply given away any hope as far as these services are concerned. The Thakurs, for example, have shifted their children to private schools. The Muraos did it slower, but they also have now shifted their children to private schools. For health services, they're completely dependent on private providers, and therefore nobody is interested in whether the public health system is working or not working, whether the cooperative is working or not working, or even the is working or not working. because for them, NREJ is meant to be a scheme only for the poor ones. So in a sense, the inequality is lead to a situation where most of the public services or most of the services meant for the poorer section of the population have become what Amartya Sen would call it as a poor services. So that is where inequality is leading to a decline in the kind of improvements in the human development outcomes. And this is not just an isolated case. This is almost everywhere. And you can see that happening in majority of the cases where income inequality is leading to a decline in collective action, decline in demand for better access to human development outcomes. And it is actually in a sense where the poorer poor people who so far were able to access non-farm jobs as a casual daily wage workers are unlikely to be able to compete when the level of skills required goes up in the non-agricultural sector. For example, when you want to become a school teacher or when you want to become a computer operator, these are the ones where these are automatically excluded from the system simply because they don't have access to education, the kind of access. So it is in a sense breeding the inequality, which itself will become self-perpetuating. So we are in a vicious cycle where inequality is likely to lead to exclusion of the poor from the process of non-farm agricultural sector.
Not audible, please. Not audible, please.
No, 1 second. Am I audible now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So now, so in a sense, what I wanted to highlight was the nature of inequality and how it is playing up a role in terms of excluding the poorest or the marginalized section of the population from accessing the non-farm jobs, which are becoming a non-farm sector, which is the dynamic sector and which is the driver of economy in the rural areas. Now, I just wanted to end with a few questions, in a sense, or a few issues that I think will be important for further discussions that we continue to have. One is that the agricultural sector, which has seen a kind of a distress or pressure coming from different reasons, both natural as well as policy induced, unlikely to have a much better outcome. I mean, three issues that I wanted to highlight. One is that the increased integration of the rural economy with the market, both in the agricultural sector as well as the non-agricultural sector, has brought in the volatility in incomes, volatility in access to various kind of jobs and services which are available to the rural economy. The inflation that has come with the volatility in the fuel prices, that is putting pressure on the agriculture sector, both in terms of input cost, of output prices. We are likely to see a situation where there is going to be a move towards more and more shift towards other crops. So that will lead to have a problem as far as food security is concerned. The increasing urbanization and demand by the non-agricultural sector is putting pressure on agricultural land as well as the agriculture sector. The younger generation in the village is not at all interested in working in agriculture, or at least, I mean, if you go and talk to any farmer, even the well-to-do farmer, they say that their sons are not interested or their daughters are not interested in continuing with the agriculture. So we see that there is some kind of a exit away from agriculture, but that exit is only a temporary one. So they go and try it out in the non-farm sector and then they come back in the agricultural sector. But what it means is that no farmer is interested in investing in the agriculture sector. For them, it's a sinking sector, and they would not like to put back any money in the agriculture sector. Rather, they will put the profit that they've earned from the agriculture sector, they would like to put it in the non-agriculture sector. But again, the non-agriculture sector is as much volatile and as much as insecure as the agricultural sector. Now, what we also see is that the agriculture sector overall is weakening because of the market penetration, because of the entry of the finance capital, entry of opening of the international trade, and all of that are basically putting larger pressure on the non-agriculture sector to perform not just an engine of growth, but also to provide access to almost all the sectors of the sections of the society, including the disadvantaged sections of it. But our own experience from Palanpur as well as from the secondary data suggests that in this process of non-farm diversification, the poor who were able to get some kind of a job, able to move out and improve their lot, are now finding it difficult to find jobs in the non-agriculture sector as it becomes more and more exclusionary. The absence of human development or absence of education and skills is also putting pressure on them for putting pressure on them to be able to access those non-farm jobs. I just wanted to put in the big issues which are likely to be important in the rural economy and for villages and the prosperity that we are looking at. Inflation and continue accompanied by deflation in incomes, which is incomes declining. But at the same time, inflation is something in the at least in this particular year has meant that their disposable income has come down. That will have an impact on their ability to access necessities, not just food, but also education and health and various other services. The distributional issues are important, and those distributional issues, particularly inequality at the village level, but inequality across sectors, rural, urban, across villages, across districts, across states, are also going to play an important role in who is going to benefit out of it and what role does the villages play. The other part is the issue of social protection, which has so far been able to protect the rural economy, both in terms of providing employment. NREGA is one example of it, but there are several other examples of it. Or, for example, the public distribution system, which has also helped to the poor people to be able to, at least the food security needs have been taken care of, at least in the last 2 years of the COVID, when they got the free food grain from the PMGKY and there are various other state level schemes. But that is not enough. I mean, that can only be a palliative. That is only something which can take care of for some time, but that can't be the way out. And it has an issue as far as the issue of mobility is concerned. There is obviously a regional balance, and we are looking at this issue of we're presenting only from UP as Uttar Pradesh is one part of it, but the way the villages operate, what the villages in Kerala are completely different from villages in Telangana or villages in Uttar Pradesh, and that regional balance is also going to the larger inequality that we see is also where we have seen, not at least in Uttar Pradesh, but in many places, large-scale migrations, but also commuting and other issues becoming leading to a different kind of an outcome. The three puzzles, which are the big questions, which I have basically put in as big questions, and we don't have to have an answer to these ones, but at least to be kept in mind, is how do we make sense of declining inequality, which is driven by at a time when their growth has been slowing down and poverty is rising. What exactly is happening? And we don't have a concrete answer to most of this, but what appears to be is a situation where everybody's income is going down, but those who are at the higher end of the income distribution have lost much more than those at the bottom end of the distribution. They somehow have been protected by various social protection that has been offered by the state. It has implications for future growth and as well as workers' welfare, future growth in terms of the demand that is being generated in the economy. And that is something which is working out as a stumbling block for the revival of the economy. But the much larger question that is where I'm going to end my presentation is the issue of social protection versus changing structure of production. Rural areas remain out of purview of economic policies, are only looked at in terms of when there is a social protection umbrella to be provided to the rural areas. The process of change that we're looking at the rural areas requires a multi-pronged approach, and not just in terms of economic incentives and economic change in the way production are organized, but also in terms of what is happening to human development outcomes, and particular education, health, nutrition. In all of these issues, rural areas continue to remain neglected. So I think there is some possibility and some hope of what has happened as far as the rural areas are concerned. But I think a challenge is much larger, and the last 5 to 7 years give us enough hint that those challenges will continue to remain important if the rural areas have to play a role of being the engine of the growth, which is what they should be, given the large size they have in population, income, as well as in employment. So I'll just stop here, and then probably when we have a discussion, then we'll have more issues to discuss.
Thank you so much, Dr. Himanshu. You leave us with a great policy question in terms of rural development, actually, and I hope that we can have more discussion on this. I would like to open the floor for questions and answers, and Dr. Peter Lanjouw, if you are here, please also unmute, because we said we are going to take the questions in a combined manner. Just one word of caution to our participants: please make your brief and very pointed, because we do not have much time left. The original program was supposed to be till 4:30. We'll try to extend it a little bit longer, but please make your brief questions and pointed questions, and raise your hand and we'll unmute yourself. The floor is now open. Thank you.
I think I'll inaugurate this question answer session. So
Yes.
it's been a very interesting presentation on the longitudinal studies in Palampur and the various changes, inequality changes in Palampur, rise in the fall in inequality and subsequent rise due to the non-farm income orientation, which is very interesting. But what I was trying to look for is a narrative on what really is happening in Palampur and what opportunities there would be for making programmatic and policy changes in view of that narrative. So I'll try to bring together what I understood from the presentations and the current changes, current scenario of changes. What we are trying to say, perhaps, and please correct me if we're wrong on this, is that the non-farm income orientation has not been equal in access to the poor, to the non-poor. The non-poor tended to gain greater access to non-farm income sources due to increased mobility or due to better skills. Whereas the poor did not have the skills. And of course, your connotation is that they had lower mobility. But on the other hand, that we know for sure, I don't know exact state of Palampur, but physical connectivity through road networks, infrastructure has much improved. Therefore, what has to be perhaps implied is that a skill deficit in the poor to be able to make use of the increased physical mobility or increased non-farm income opportunities. That is one scenario that I see from what's perhaps happening in Palampur. Other thing, as Professor Himanshu was mentioning, is that there is a decline and decay in public services in the villages, in the village Palampur. Many institutions, village level institutions, are in decline. People are looking to services from the private sector. Could this have a policy implication for us to say that, look, the private sector is able to take substantive space of the public sector institutions? In which case, there is a stream of thought to say that, look, why don't we get a lot of the civil society organizations and the private sector to come into the rural areas and provide these private sector based services and find ways of enhancing income of the rural populace, moving them substantially from agriculture. Now, the discussion has veered around to say that, look, there's perhaps agriculture is becoming unprofitable. Agriculture may be becoming unprofitable because earlier there was a good base effect that there was a lot of demand for agricultural produce. Now that kind of demand for agricultural produce is no longer there in the country. We don't have so much of a deficit of agricultural produce. We are exporting very substantially agricultural produce. And within agriculture, as one of the presenters was mentioning, the greater accent is towards animal husbandry and other related sectors of agriculture. Should we be then focusing on more on the next step from agriculture and non-farm income by trying to generate economic activities and income generating activities in the rural areas, such as value-added products of agriculture, such as non-farm based enterprises of self-help groups and other entities, because in this country now we have about 70 lakh self-help groups and 80 lakh self-help groups, and about 8 crore women in the self-help groups. They don't seem to be doing much. So is this a pointer that, look, we could organize them better, organize them into micro enterprises? So greater income generation takes place in the village economy. And with that, they are able to pay for the private sector services which are provided for. In addition, government may decrease its emphasis on public services and put money by way of direct benefit transfer or universal basic income, as whatever you call, into the hands of the ultra poor, so that they also have access to the private sector services that could increasingly be provided for in the rural areas. Could this be a narrative scenario that we could be looking at based on the current situation in Palampur and where it came from in the past?
Professor Lanjouw, you may take the comment first, and then we'll move on to Professor Himanshu.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think this is a very interesting conjecture or proposal, and it's well worth. I think there's many different aspects to it. One thing that I was interested in your remarks was this whole issue of connectivity, because I think certainly from our experience in the Palampur story is that this connectivity of Palampur to the wider economy has been very central to what has happened in the village. So the ability to leave the village and commute essentially to nearby towns has been a really central part of the story of rising non-farm incomes in the village. However, I mean, I think as Himanshu has emphasized, one thing that we've also documented is that these non-farm incomes are quite volatile. I mean, it's not. First of all, there's a great spectrum in the types of non-farm activities that are out there, and also they're prone to employment opportunities arrive, but then also disappear again. And I think they're an important quest for resting or relying on the non-farm sector as a sort of one of the main engines of rising rural incomes and rural livelihoods would be also to address this volatility element. In that connection, one issue that I think is actually something that doesn't often get discussed, but I think is actually really important in this debate, is the fact that in some respects, rural livelihoods and the circumstances in rural areas are going to be in some sense contingent on urban policies. And what I have in mind here is that these small towns that are in the vicinity of Palampur is located obviously in the Gangetic Plain, which is densely populated, and there's lots of towns that are that are easily reachable to Palampur villagers. These small towns are really critically important in terms of providing these job opportunities. If we see that commuting is possible because of improved connectivity, roads have been improved, and so on. So commuting from Palampur to these nearby towns is important. Then the employment situation in these small towns is something that needs to be thought through very carefully. And that means that urban policies of galvanizing urban areas need to also focus very strongly on these small towns, these towns that are servicing the rural areas. And that's a really important part of this equation of relying on the non-farm sector as a possible means towards generating these higher incomes. So I certainly think that that's something that needs to be part of the discussion as well. And it's kind of interesting that we often maybe need to look to urban policies to help us address rural poverty issues, at least to some extent. Clearly, on top of that are the issues that you raised, and this idea of relying on, say, whether it's transfer schemes or a combination of transfer schemes and rural non-farm development to sort of raise income so that we can then rely on the ability, purchasing power, capacity of even the poorer segments of society to pay for privately provided public services. That equation would hinge critically on this likelihood and this capacity of the rural non-farm sector to really generate those incomes in a stable way and to provide access to those incomes also to the less advantaged segments of the rural communities. But I'm sure Himanshu has a number of additional observations to make on this.
Please unmute yourself.
I think you made the right point here that So far, we have looked at the non-farm sector as something which is a homogeneous entity. In a sense, anything which is not agriculture is treated as non-agricultural sector. But a non-agricultural sector in itself is quite diverse, and access to the non-agriculture sector depends a lot on skill, which I'm not talking about only in terms of particular skills, but even basic education is something which plays an important role in your ability to access some of these non-agricultural jobs. And I think for the first 10, 15 years, at least after 2000 and up to middle of the 2000s, the non-agricultural sector absorbed a large majority of the people who are in the informal sector, who are daily wages, going to the brick kiln or as headloaders in the Moradabad railway yard, or construction workers, or as simple as manual laborers. But I think the second level of non-agricultural sector requires an effort both from the demand side as well as from the supply side. I think from the demand side, I think we need to open up, and where I think Peter has made a very, very valuable point, is to use the small towns or the nearby areas as hubs. I mean, not everybody can come to Delhi, or not everybody can come to Mumbai or the bigger ones. On the other hand, our urban policies have really been more focused towards the big metropolitan ones rather than on the smaller towns. The Guntur and the Medak and others are as important as a hub for providing dynamism to the rural areas as Hyderabad and other places are. But I think the next level of non-farm diversification also requires some kind of an effort from the government to be able to equip the people to access those services. And that will basically mean that we really have to think about education and health as important part of the drivers of this whole transition or whole transformation that we're looking at. And I really am not very comfortable with the idea of these two essential parts of the whole transformation process being handed over to the private sector. We have seen really flourishing of the private education sector, particularly the private schools. Most of them are unregulated with really a varying quality, bad quality education at a very exorbitant prices where there is no monitoring. And I think those private sectors schools are not schools in that sense, but more like shops, as I would say it very clearly. But people are sending them simply because they promise this English medium and all sorts of things. But in many cases, that is not the approach I think I would take it, and certainly not for health, where we have seen that unqualified doctors in the village and other places claiming to be solving all sorts of problems, but in the process, the poor people are the ones who are suffering out of it. And one episode of health shock basically puts a generation in debt. That is the kind of cost that you pay for private health. And I don't think the private sector is in a position to be able to provide the level of, in fact, it will raise inequality further. It will basically exclude a large number of the poorer sections from being able to access basic health and basic education. So I think we need to have a thinking about what kind of a model are we proposing as far as education and health are concerned. The other issue which I wanted to highlight, and which is what I could not come in because what I liked about your introductory remark is that is when you're a probationer and you went to a village and the whole issue of village surveys. I think the important point that is being talked about here is our ability to be able to collect good quality data, both at the large nationally representative secondary data, but also village surveys, in which India used to be a pioneer. In fact, the Palanpur first two surveys were conducted by a government institution, the Agro-Economic Research Centers. And if I'm not mistaken, even NIRD used to conduct village surveys. And I would say that these are the ones which give us a very granular picture of what exactly is the process of transitioning rather than simply the aggregate numbers. And I think those will give you a much better idea of what is happening to the villages. I think more of these are required in different parts of the country to be able to really figure out that is it actually the skills, is it actually the human, is the education, health, or what exactly are the problems? Because I don't think Palanpur is a representative of 650,000 villages that we have in our country, and not even of a particular state. But it does point out the issues that are going to be there. And I think those issues now appear to be very common. And I will just point out, one is this issue of exclusion for a large majority of the poor from able to access non-agricultural jobs in and around the villages, but also in the urban areas and in also other places. The second is obviously the huge requirement of skills and education that will be needed for the second wave of non-farm diversification. Not everybody can be a manual laborer or a blicken worker or as construction workers. I think we will be requiring more and more skilled workers of various non-agricultural goods and services. A lot of them can be provided in the rural economy itself. The third is the urban in the agriculture, non-agriculture linkages. I don't think the policy of, so far what we have followed so far is where agriculture has been seen to be a residual one, and the non-agriculture sector is the one which is where most of the focus has been. I think unless incomes in agriculture improve, I don't think the non-agricultural sector will be able to provide the demand. And the last point I wanted to say that agriculture still has huge demand that can be provided. I mean, just to point it out, 60% of our total edible oil consumption is imported. We still are, we might be only exporting in terms of rice and other commodities, but we still have deficit as far as basic nutrition is concerned, edible oil, pulses, and various other things. So I think there is a huge potential of agricultural incomes rising, agricultural diversification in terms of high value crops, agricultural processing, fruits, and exportable items. So I don't think the agriculture story is over and we have to simply shift to the non-agriculture sector. The non-agriculture sector will only survive and thrive if the agriculture sector provides enough incomes for people to be able to diversify and to be able to consume those non-agricultural goods and services which are being produced in the rural economy. I think that we require a much more holistic approach than simply looking at them as a separate silo of agriculture and non-agricultural sector. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Himanshu. I think our director of them. There are many questions. I'll not read out all of them, but there is one where Mr. K. Nagarajan is asking where correction of correct data is a great task and imperfect data lead to difficulties in scheme implementation and causing failure of the planning. So he's asking how to get correct data. Probably this is from the village studies. He's seeking some input on how to make the data more valid.
I think it's not just the village surveys, but I think also secondary data where we have gone behind. I mean, remember two of the largest sources of data, the National Sample Survey data as well as the census, which were much more useful in terms of our ability to make sense of what is going on at a larger scale. Census, I don't know when it is going to be conducted and when the data is going to be available. And this was a very important, valuable source of information. The NSS surveys, obviously, we know that the consumption surveys are yet to be released. And those are, again, a very valuable information as to what is happening to different sections of the population. So we have to have a much greater effort into collecting large-scale data, but also village-level data. And I mean, the whole small area technique depends, uses the large-scale data to be able to go down to the level of, if you combine the large sample survey with the census to be able to bring out the kind of granular picture that Peter has presented. So I think it's both effort are needed, much more in terms of village surveys, but not at the cost of the large scale secondary data surveys, which have their own meaning and own interpretations as far as the larger trends are concerned. Peter, you'd like to add to that?
No, it's simply just, I mean, I completely agree with everything you said, but I would just simply add that I think these longitudinal village surveys are a potential of great value. I think we heard about the ICRISAT study that was mentioned in the director's opening remarks. There is a long tradition, or there was a long tradition of collecting such data in India, and I really do think it would be really valuable to return to that. But it also requires a recognition that that's a long-term investment. You can't get longitudinal data without actually undertaking these data collection efforts in villages over a long period of time. So it's something that obviously can't be conjured instantly, but would require a careful systematic effort to collect data. One can always start with initial rounds of data collection and then build additional rounds on top of them. But it's clearly something that I think would be very valuable, but also something that would require a real systematic effort.
Thank you, Professor Lanjouw. I see Professor Brandon has raised her hand again. I would really like you to unmute yourself, Brandon, and there is some issue with your connective of them. There are many questions. I'll not read out all of them, but there is one where Mr. K. Nagarajan is asking where correction of correct data is a great task and imperfect data lead to difficulties in scheme implementation and causing failure of the planning. So he's asking how to get correct data. Probably this is from the village studies. He's seeking some input on how to make the data more valid.
I think it's not just the village surveys, but I think also secondary data where we have gone behind. I mean, remember, two of the largest sources of data, the National Sample Survey data as well as the census, which were much more useful in terms of our ability to make sense of what is going on at a larger scale. Census, I don't know when it is going to be conducted and when the data is going to be available. And this was a very important, valuable source of information. The NSS surveys, obviously, we know that the consumption surveys are yet to be released. And those are, again, a very, very valuable information as to what is happening to different sections of the population. So we have to have a much greater effort into collecting large-scale data, but also village-level data. And I mean, the whole small area technique depends, uses the large-scale data to be able to go down to the level of, if you combines the large sample survey with the census to be able to bring out the kind of granular picture that Peter has presented. So I think it's both effort are needed, much more in terms of village surveys, but not at the cost of the large-scale secondary data surveys, which have their own meaning and own interpretations as far as the larger trends are concerned. Peter, you'd like to add to that?
No, it's simply just, I mean, I completely agree with everything you said, but I would just simply add that I think these longitudinal village surveys are a potential of great value. I think we heard about the ICRISAT study that was mentioned in the director's opening remarks. There is a long tradition, or there was a long tradition of collecting such data in India, and I really do think it would be really valuable to return to that. But it also requires a recognition that that's a long-term investment. You can't get longitudinal data without actually undertaking these data collection efforts in villages over a long period of time. So it's something that obviously can't be conjured instantly, but would require a careful systematic effort to collect data. One can always start with initial rounds of data collection and then build additional rounds on top of them. But it's clearly something that I think would be very valuable, but also something that would require a real systematic effort.
Thank you, Professor Lanjouw. I see Professor Brandon has raised her hand again. I would really like you to unmute yourself, Brandon, and there is some issue with your connectivity. Again, probably some issue with the connectivity. Right, so there are also no questions in the chat box as such. So I think we can move on to the closure of the program today. Partha, do you have any comment to the presentation? You can please ask now.
No, you please close down.
Okay. First of all, on behalf of National Institute of Rural Development and Panchayati Raj and Director General of NIRDPR, I would really like to thank our speakers for taking out the time and patiently engaging with us and staying till the end of the program. We hope to kind of take these discussions that we are doing, and this is series is going on for quite some time. We have had webinars earlier on focused areas of sustainable development goals, and what we are trying to do is to kind of discuss around formation of a rural development policy in the future. So we hope that these discussions will be able to collate it and then bring out a handbook of RD policy to come in the future. And if I understand what you have said today and what we are also discussing, that what are the larger policy questions, or it's not just a series of systematic programs or palliative palliative programs to work with the emergencies, but also larger questions to do with overall rural development. So with that, I would like to close the program here, and if there are any no further comments, we can close the webinar session here, and hope that our speakers also join us for our next webinars or next programs and continue this dialogue and continue to work with us till we reach the RD policy for India. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ruchira.
Thank you very much. Also to our participants, I would like to announce that our next program will be on 22nd of December on education, quality education, that is our SDG 4. So please join us again for 22nd December. Until then, thank you very much, and good evening and good morning to people who are not here, and good evening to people who are here. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.